So the next speaker is Dr. Scott Steele on regulatory science to advance precision medicine. He's an associate professor at the University of Rochester. Scott.
Thank you, Neil, and appreciate the opportunity to participate in this session. So I wanted to give you just a brief overview of an initiative that we've been helping to coordinate that's focused on identifying some of the regulatory science gaps and opportunities to advance precision medicine therapies, approaches, and methods. And part of the goal of that is then to tie that into the findings from that, to tie that into education and training initiatives. So just to set a brief context, and Frank and Neil talked a little bit about the FDA priorities in this area, and so our group that I'll discuss is really utilize what FDA has defined as regulatory science and some of the priority areas to be a foundation for our work, whether at the center level, of course, whether it's drugs, biologics, devices. There have been a number of priority areas defined by FDA, gaps and opportunities that need to be addressed. And as we think about precision medicine, certainly many of these tie in directly. Frank talked quite a bit about some of the opportunities around clinical trial design and different types of trials to drive precision medicine. More broadly, whether it's nanotechnology or 3D printing or other areas have certainly been an area of focus. And then I think increasingly digital health, mobile health, that really can help tie in and present some unique challenges for the agency and for the research community to help inform regulatory decision making. So the work I'll talk about has really been driven by part of this Clinical and Translational Science Award Network, which is supported by our NIH. There's close to 60 of these institutions across the U.S., which are really focused on advancing translational research and education, really as an infrastructure to support that process. And Frank mentioned the CIRCE program, I think, and I think has some really related goals and opportunities to work across this network of academic institutions and, of course, with other industry partners, with the agencies, scientific societies, and others. So we've really tried to leverage this as a research and educational network. So the group that I wanted to mention, which is made up of those members of that different educational network, but also other stakeholders, industry partners, scientific societies, the FDA, NIH, some of our other government agencies, was really had a goal to look at, as we think about precision medicine, and I'll mention some specific topics, there's really some unique regulatory science challenges to help advance those approaches. And so the idea of this group, which formed early last year, was to identify some specific topics where we felt we could really have an impact and look at both what's the emerging science, the emerging technology on the horizon, and what are some of the regulatory considerations, and then develop some specific recommendations moving forward. So the group's goal is to identify a set of topics, and that would be the foundation for an annual forum that would bring these different stakeholders together to then ultimately provide some recommendations. Again, with a goal also, as academic institutions are a core part of this, to lead and tie into some of the training and education initiatives. So when we started this early last year in 2017, the group started by looking at a broad set of potential topics, again, where there might be some unique regulatory science gaps to advance precision medicine, and kind of tiered these into two areas. And as you can see, it was a pretty broad set initially, from questions around stem cell-based therapies to next generation sequencing to 3D printing to other areas around gene editing, gene therapy, to more digital and mobile health issues. So for our first forum last year, it was held in September, again as a partnership with a number of stakeholders, but particularly University of Rochester, University of Virginia, and then with the Pharma Foundation, hosted in Washington, D.C. The group decided to focus on two topics listed here, one being questions around the unique regulatory considerations around 3D printing and additive manufacturing, particularly as you bring in cell-based products and those combination products. And the other being around omics more broadly. So there's been a lot of focus on next generation sequencing and some guidance put out on the FDA on use of next generation sequencing diagnostics. But as we think about integrating that with proteomics, metabolomics, and other related types of approaches, what are some of the unique regulatory issues that come up there in moving those products forward? So we did a lot of advanced work to bring this more of a roundtable discussion of group together to think about what are the What are some of the opportunities here to advance precision medicine? What are the roadblocks? What's the emerging science? And then what are some of the key scientific questions that need to be addressed? So I won't go through the agenda in detail, but again, we focused on both of those topics, more of a roundtable format, again, with speakers from FDA, academia, industry, in both topics, the 3D printing and this omics and precision medicine. What's the state of the science, what's on the horizon, and what are likely some of the regulatory gaps, and perhaps where there are current models, regulatory pathways that could tie into this and be informative. We then would break out into the sessions focused on both areas, coming up with what are the key priorities, and then starting to think about the recommendations to address those. Again, pretty diverse group. Actually, our National Institutes of Science and Standards and Technology, which some of you may be familiar with, actually a key partner in this and obviously very focused on standards development. So I won't go through these in great detail, but some of the key findings for each of those areas are listed here on our 3D printing and additive manufacturing group, questions around thinking about flexible regulations for the different pathways, issues around different manufacturing models. Again, education and training was identified as a key issue for both of these topics, and I'll discuss that in a minute. Questions around monitoring cell viability throughout the manufacturing process. In the omics area, general issues around standardization of these more complex tests, particularly as you're integrating proteomics, genomics, other different omics, and some of the challenges there. Establishing clinical validity and utility, of course. And then again, some of these education, training, knowledge gaps across different sectors were identified as an important issue to address. And we then split off two different writing teams who've picked up these two topics, further developed those key findings and provided some recommendations. And those two publications were actually just accepted recently, so they'll be coming out shortly. So building off that first forum, using that as a model, the group quickly started thinking about future topics. One of the recommendations was to focus on one. I think we were a little ambitious the first time around with two. But for this year, we're also, again, holding it in September again, later this month in Washington, D.C. The group decided to focus on digital health, particularly trying to narrow that down a little bit, particularly thinking about questions around mobile sensors, wearable devices, and two primary areas we're planning to break out. One more around this information interface, so utilizing where software and other tools are being utilized around the analytics. FDA is focused on this software as a medical device, and so starting to think about how software and other tools are regulated. And then more the user interface, so different types of sensors, what are some of the human factors tied into that around digital health, and what are some of the unique regulatory challenges. And then, of course, in this area, again, we'll think about the emerging science, the regulatory considerations, but also, as was mentioned a little bit by Frank, I think the questions around real-world data, real-world evidence, patient-reported outcomes, how this is integrated, questions around privacy, data privacy, and storage and use of that data, and what the role for the patient is in some of that too. So we'll use a similar format with some short presentations at the beginning, and then really focus on our breakout sessions. So again, goal is to have a pretty diverse audience for that. So just quickly, as we think now about tying some of the key findings and recommendations from the forum, particularly in these emerging technology areas, into training opportunities, we think there's a few areas to potentially focus. One around core competencies to guide training and education, which I'll touch on in a minute, which we and other of the institutions have utilized for regulatory science, and how we can maybe update those. Different training pathways, whether it's rotations or internships, early for trainees, early career, or for those more mid-career who would like to do a rotation, and particularly as these emerging technology areas come up. And then, of course, really further leveraging public-private partnerships in these areas. So a few years ago now, a number of our institutions gathered over a couple-year process with a number of stakeholders to develop core competencies in regulatory science, where we felt this was a real gap as we thought about how to integrate this into our training programs, or where new training programs might be needed. And I know Frances will, I'm sure, mention some of the work she's been really leading in this area. We kind kind of culminated this in a workshop with a number of different partners to finalize a set of core thematic areas and competencies. Won't go through these, but really broad 11 areas with a number of associated competencies in each, really to help guide educational programs, even the training opportunities, case studies that might be developed, and these served as a bit of a foundation. And another key part of this, the workshop and some of our subsequent work among a number of partners, was to complement this academic training with what we called tripartite training at the time, that ideally integrating a rotation or some kind of experiential experience in industry and ideally at a regulatory agency as well. So just to sum up, as we think about where we could integrate some of the findings of our forum and other areas in emerging technology, whether it's nano, 3D printing, additive manufacturing, the digital health area, there's certainly a number of opportunities to integrate into curriculum, whether it's through courses, modules, case studies. A number of us have really focused on using real-world case studies in some of these areas, whether it's biomarkers, the omics area, and so I think we could really integrate those in a very flexible way, whether it's in a course or a standalone. We've also had trainees develop their own case study as a bit of a hands-on experience to go through that process. Certainly with the internships and rotations in industry, at FDA, and other academic institutions to gain that particular expertise, whether it's in manufacturing or digital areas. And then, of course, collaborative research projects with different partners. And then finally, I was just going to mention that now that it's been a few years, we are in the process of updating our competencies for regulatory science with other partners. And so we originally focused on medical product development exclusively, so had originally planned to go back and look at issues of other areas that FDA regulates, such as food, tobacco, which may have unique competencies required, and so I think this is an opportunity to integrate and see where there might be areas around nanotechnology, 3D printing, digital health that perhaps should be factored into that process. So, thank you.
Thank you, Scott.